Our next speaker is Kristin Hayward-Strobel, who will present on practices for engaging students and making connections, focusing on Llamo in Kenya. Kristin is a world history teacher at Lexington High School in Lexington, Mass. She's studied in Belgium, France, and Turkey. And in 2005, she went on a Fulbright Hays trip to the Swahili coast, where she lived with host families and traveled to Swahili cities in Kenya and Tanzania. So since 2000, Kristin has been teaching a wide variety of world history classes in the public schools of Springfield and Lexington in Massachusetts. And I first learned about Kristin's teaching through Dr. Barbara Brown, who recommended her wonderful resources that she had developed. And Kristin has been a great collaborator in this workshop. The materials she's developed to engage her students with the Swahili Coast are really precisely the kind of angle that we want to emphasize in our practice. So welcome, Kristin.
So first of all, wow, it's that is not an easy presentation to follow. That was amazing. But I think what we just saw was this is just an incredible emphasis on like how important it is to have the tiny, right? To look at the tiny elements, this very specific things, because that's what the whole wider world history framework is built upon. And you know, so that's kind of what I wanted to do with this presentation. As I said, first of all, I just want to like acknowledge the elephant in the room. You high school and elementary and middle school educators, people who have been educating this year, I just want to say, like, you're amazing for showing up this morning. That is incredible. This year has just been something else. And unless you're like actually actively teaching it, nobody else understands all the things that you have gone through this year. So I just want to say, like, you're amazing for showing up and doing anything extra. So before this is like, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of the kind of the lecture I'm going to do, or I've done with students before. And because I teach unleveled world history in a, it's like a 1700 kind of class, right? The very typical workhorse world history class. So everything I do in that class has to be justified because I'm giving up teaching something else in the world right at that time. And so the way that I've kind of structured this, because I wanted to teach about the Swahili in a little more in depth than I would otherwise, I had to kind of think about how to angle it, right? How do I think about this in a way that it can do several things at once? And so what I kind of settled on is having the kids think about the world that their culture is based on. Like, let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, here we go. So I want to ask you all to kind of take a minute to just think about the town that you are in, wherever you are. And think about, and you can even pull out a piece of paper here or put it in the chat, but think about what historical processes and actually have created the town that you live in. What are the things that make your town the way it is, right? There are a whole lot of different ways you could go with that. But think about, like, what is, like, I'm just going to give you a minute to write that down. Two things, write two things down that make your town what it is. Two historical processes. You can think about economics. You can think about all sorts of things. So when I look at Lexington, Mass, I put a picture up here. You can see there's the battle green in the center. You can see the Congregationalist Church. Now it's a Unitarian Church. These are some of the big historical processes, right, that would have shaped this town, right? If it hadn't been the birthplace of the American Revolution, this green patch that's worth a lot of money would have been built on, right? This church used to own the town. And so it's right on the town square. Like, there are things that are really, that help to build that town the way that it is. A big church split in the 1800s meant there's another church right over here, right? So these are big, like, historical processes that kind of developed that town. And so one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it this way is because sometimes when we look at other cultures, we don't necessarily think of ourselves as also being impacted by these big historical processes. So I'm going to come back to that question again at the end of the presentation. But anyway, so before I get to this lecture with the students, I usually talk about the Indian Ocean network as a whole. So they understand the monsoon winds, going back, going this direction from April to September, and so they understand the big significance here. And here, like just to give you a sense for those of you who may not have a real picture in your mind about the Indian Ocean trade network of the 1500s and before, this is, so I've got too many windows open here. So we're going to be looking at Llamo, which is right around here. The trade is going back and forth through all these areas. Cloves and spices come from a tiny, tiny little island over here. And you can see the full extent, I think this image here, the African giraffe in China in 1414 shows you how extensive this trade network was. So just one little piece of evidence you can use with students. So we're going to be looking at this tiny little town, but before we get there, I want to make sure that my students know that Kenya has big cities like Nairobi, right? And so I do spend some time kind of talking a little bit about that and about where the major infrastructure is of the city. And then I show them how far away Llamo is. In many cases, you have to fly there. It is really kind of off the beaten path of the post-colonial Kenyan infrastructure, but was at the time very, very much a part of the Indian Ocean trade network, right? And it's one of the many city-states that go along the coast here. Here it is. There's a cafe there, and this cafe had the great review of "I did not hate it," so I thought that was worthy of note. So here we are, and as you get closer, you can see that there are all of these little, very, very narrow city streets, and I think I'm missing oops, there it is. Okay, it's right here. So when you get closer, you can see that the town is actually an island, right? And on this island, you can see that they bring their Coca-Cola over. So they have their sugar rush, just like everybody else. And so here are these, the streets of Llamo. You're right, you can see how they're incredibly close and tight. And I would ask the students more about that as their observations. And here's our basic timeline for the city, right? 1370, the city is established. 1506 is when the Portuguese come in. But Llamo has a different experience here because they're a little further out. They were able to kick out the Portuguese with help from Oman. And so they become for a while a protectorate of Oman. Then there's British rule into the 1960s. But during that time of British rule, they're kind of, as we saw, they're kind of the hinterland. And that has allowed for Llamo to kind of keep some of its, to be, it's given it some separation from European or British colonial policies. So this is where we are. And here you can see the city. And you can see that it's an urban area here, and then on the outskirts you can see that there are farm fields, and every bit of this land is spoken for. I think that's also really important for students to know that the land itself is, it may look rural to them, but every little piece of that is spoken for. So you can see here, as a tourist, the first things you might see are these, the things that come into the donkeys, doors and dows. But these are also sort of interesting parts of the history of this area, right? It's traders who we've just heard come from Africa itself, and also you have the Gujarati influences, and from India you have Oman. This is an Omani door that, like, at different time periods in Lamu's history, as these different trading systems come in, they create different styles of doors and you know, ways that they can mark their home. The dhows themselves, right? This incredibly important piece of technology. Their boats are still made there. So this is a picture I have of one of the boats that was being printed there. You can see they often have an eye, and this beautiful blue wood carving is distinctive of the dhow, the triangular sail here that allows them to tack closer to the wind. So there's just, those are some of the first things you might see. And here again is that lateen sail, so essential for European colonization of the New World, right? It's this technology that was borrowed from the Indian Ocean Trade Network. This is, you know, a replica of one of the Columbus's ships, and you can see that they took their stable sail and that allowed stability on the rough Atlantic Ocean, but they also took, once they had the lateen sail, they were able to tack closer to the wind. And enabled them to, you know, to get across the Atlantic. And of course, the other part of that technology was the Chinese compass. And here's just another image of dhows coming in. As I took this picture as people, about 5 minutes later, a fish market just appeared. As the fishermen came in, they brought their fish, and people appeared from the town and began bargaining right away. So it's just a really beautiful sight. So, and we've talked also just about the different ways that trade played out in Llamo's history. And so you can see some of the things that historically they traded, right? Mangroves, ivory, which we just heard about, the rhino horns and hippo teeth and shark's fins. Some of these goods that would have gone out into the Indian Ocean Trade Network. And some of these were things like cashews, who, you know, like at different times, Llamo is trading different things. Cashews come from Native American crop, but they were able to be planted and produced there and shipped out. And also, as we've seen, slaves, you know, Llamo did have a slave trade, and which varied significantly over time in its height and who was controlling it and where people who were enslaved went. Yeah, so these are some of the sea cucumbers in China. So you can see that that trade is still very active today. So yeah, so the other places where we see these historical processes in charge. So we've just looked at how the economy is very much shaped by geography, what can be grown there, what can be produced there. Right, food is also really interesting because, of course, you have African ingredients, you're on the coast, you have and African practices of preparing food, and yet also you see this connection with the Indian trade. So if you look, they have chapati. We saw how the rice was already being farmed there in the 1800s or 800s. The fish, right? Kids are always impressed in America because they're unaccustomed to seeing a fish with a head on it. But of course, most of the rest of the world would not buy a fish without a head, because that's how you tell it's fresh, by looking at the eyes. And of course, American students are also really interested in the fact that there's no silverware here. So that's another kind of interesting conversation about table manners and how important it is to be able to eat with your hands, but also to know all the rules. And as a left-handed person, I know a lot about breaking rules when you are eating with your hands. I had to ask 1,000 questions, right? Because it's not that you never use your left hand, because the left hand is unclean. But it's not so simple that you never use your left hand. There's a lot of rules about like when it's okay to use your left hand and when it's not. And because, you know, but it's a fascinating sort of process of trying to learn that, because, you know, it's like anything else. There is proper eating and there is not. So yeah, if any of my Indian students already know these rules and laugh a lot when I tell them all the different ways that I broke these rules with my left hand. So it's yeah. So we talked also in the earlier lecture about Swahili being spoken by many, many people that would not consider themselves Swahili, right? Swahili live on the coast. They tend to live on the coast. They tend to be Muslim, tend to be a more of an urban culture. But over 100 million people speak Kiswahili, and Kiswahili is the language itself. It is a Bantu-based language, right? It is an African language, but it has Arabic, Indian, and Persian vocabulary as well because it was a trading language. And here's a little bit of how it sounds.
Wote wamezaliwa huru, hadi na haki zao ni sawa. Wote wamejaliwa akili na dhamiri, hivyo yapasa watendeane kindugu.
So I think it's, I just wanted the kids to kind of hear what that looks like. Coming back to economics and agriculture, the mangrove poles are a really interesting case study for this. And on the Swahili coast, it's pretty difficult to find wood that is insect resistant, and mangroves are one of those woods that actually do tend to resist insects for at least for a period of time. And so they're used, but they're not particularly straight, as you can see the mangrove groves here. So they're usually cut in very specific ways, like about 10 feet. And they go into the dhows at about 10 feet. Traditionally, they can be shipped. And that's why you will also see Swahili rooms being in a traditionally Swahili house will be narrow because they have to kind of fit with those narrower mangrove poles. And I just here you can see the design of a traditionally large, this would be an elite Swahili home, right? This is not what everyone could afford, but what these traders that we were talking about could afford. And there are some historians who've thought that the great mosque in Cordoba, the Islamic arch there, was influenced by the fact that these mangrove poles, which are not just used on the Swahili coast, but are sent all throughout the Indian Ocean region, are some of the influences perhaps for that Islamic arch. Which I just love the fact that there's, these connections between various different parts of the globe. And I also think it's important to talk a little bit about the people in the picture. Here's Vi. He was a really excellent student whose father died. And of course, he wasn't able to go on to school, but his niece was, and he was kind enough to take me around to see the boat building. And just such a wonderful man, so naturally gifted, and just a fascinating academic who, of course, didn't get to the chance to kind of be the academic he should have been because of educational, being caught off from educational opportunities. But I just like to be able to talk a little bit with my students about individual humans because, it's just important to know that these are real people doing real things all the time with various different stories. This woman here is looking at the house that their family is rebuilding. This is her original house from when she was a child. Her sister has married an American man who was a Peace Corps volunteer and then made lots of money in Saudi Arabia. They rebuilt the house and they hired lots and lots of traditional artists to redo their house in the traditional way. So this is just a kind of an interesting piece of things. And here's just some other Swahili homes. And we've been talking about the porcelain. Here's where you would put it, right? In these most centralized part of the house. So if you're going to do a real trade, like a long distance trade is really important. You need to know that the person has capital to back it up. And so you would bring a business partner maybe into this last bit of the house here where you'd see how the extent of their wealth. But the outside of the Swahili home is pretty plain. And I'm going to show you just a clip of this here really quickly. This is from the Basil Davidson film in the 1980s. But he's going to just show you there's just a minute, but I think it's fun to see what the inside of these houses looks like.
The porch with benches for receiving guests. And even when the handsome front doors are opened, there's still only a blank wall behind.
Could you put the sound louder?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
True story.
You know what that is. Thank you.
600 or 700 years ago, when
Better?
houses like this one first began to be designed and built by Swahili architects for leading men and merchants, there were few houses anywhere else in the world so well designed for comfortable city life.
So coral
This particular house dates from the early 18th century, but much older examples of Swahili domestic architecture not only demonstrated a unique construction and embellishment, but were built to a high standard of what we now call modern conveniences. While the inhabitants of London in Elizabethan times were emptying chamber pots out of the window, Swahili residents of Llamo who could afford such a house as this enjoyed the luxury of good internal sanitation.
These old Swahili houses spell out for us the basic aims that guided the architects in their design: to make the best possible use of local materials, finely plastered coral stone, necessarily short rafters of mangrove tree poles, and then to ensure a high level of domestic privacy, and not least to show off and guarantee the creditworthiness of the owner, so essential in a community whose livelihood always depended on the profits and the risks of long-distance trade.
So that's just gives you a sense of what these homes look like. I love, this is the old bathrooms, and it just, and here's a woman who is running the museum, or ran the museum when I was there. So yeah, the one of the things that I like to talk about with the students also is, you know, we did talk about how Islam does come into the Swahili coast really early. It's in its long distance trade. It is not, you know, there's not militaries coming in. This is a trade, a process of you know, families coming, or traders coming, and people realizing, you know, having children, building schools, building mosques, and slowly things, you know, Islam is adopted. But it isn't the same type of Islam in East Africa, and just in the same way that the Christianity that's practiced in the United States is not the same Christianity that's been practiced in Ethiopia since the 300s, right? They're not, the Coptic Christians in Ethiopia are not celebrating Christmas with Christmas trees, you know, evergreen Christmas trees, right? That's a European tradition that was brought to the Americas. So that's a different cultural process, right? Process that informed our different religious traditions. The same thing can be seen here on the Swahili coast. For example, down here you can see this is an owl. Somebody just had a baby in this house, and this is a scare owl. It's something to scare away the owls, because owls are bad luck. And if you have a new baby, you want to make sure that new baby is as safe as possible. I also really like to talk about this because it just kind of brings us back to a little bit about, you know, where this place is located. Before, I often ask the students, like, what's the AH, right? What is the AD actually? Some of them don't know that either. And why is the sign in English, right? And the AH is after Hijra, right? This is the Islamic calendar. AD is Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, so it's the Christian calendar. And of course, this is in English because Kenya was colonized by the British. So that's sort of always an interesting kind of conversation. But just to see these mosques are obviously so different than mosques that you're going to see in other parts of the Muslim world. This mosque here looks like it could have been built out of 1970s, you know, concrete brick, but it's actually coral stone, and it's from the 900s. So and here's an older version of a mosque here, where the plaster has come off and you can see the coral stone itself. The Swahili are, you know, much of the coast is actually built, or is sort of constructed on old coral reefs. And if you cut the coral stone under the water and then bring it up, it's like it cuts pretty easily under the water, and it's pretty durable outside of the water. So it keeps things cool in the summer, and you know, it holds the heat in the winter, and it's a very nice construction, obviously you can't do that now, the reefs in that area, but you can dig down in the ground and you'll find still a lot of coral just in the earth itself, which is still used in construction. So I would also have the kids look at just as a festival, just to get a sense for who's living there in Llamo. And you can see kind of what people are wearing, and you can see here the influence of Islam, but also very, very localized styles, right? Here the men are wearing different kufia from these, in which I'll talk about that in a minute, but traditionally each of these hats would be from a different region, right? And you'd be able to tell like what village that person's from. One of the things that kids can point out here is the bui bui, which you see here, which is the traditional dress, right, of the Swahili coast for middle-class women. And I think this is an important distinction. When you see women wearing the bui bui, it is often middle-class. It's not necessarily something that servants would wear, or that, and there are many different cultural norms and around dress that I think are really important. Right here is this is in Llamo in the 1980s. This is a Llamo bui bui. This is not the kind of bui bui you'd wear in Mombasa, right? This is Mombasa. And here are 3 Llamo teachers who are wearing the Mombasa bui bui because it's seen as like a little more hip as opposed to the one in Llamo. But here, if you go back, I don't know if I can go back or not, but oh no, that is not what I meant to do. No. Where is that picture of the other woman wearing a Mombasa? Oh, I lost it, but there it is. Here, she's wearing the bui bui from Llamo. You can see that you have the power to take that bui bui allows you to show off your clothes if you want to, right? See, these women have taken their hands and they can, so in Llamo, there's an entire culture of like 1,000 ways to drop your veil. And so they have total control if they want to show you their entire outfit or not. And I was with a lot of women with conversations about which bui bui do you wear? And some of their husbands were like, you should start wearing the Mombasa bui bui. And they were like, nope, we're not going to. We're sticking with the Llamo bui bui. You can see the other, the younger teachers have made different choices. So it's just kind of interesting to see. These are some of the stuff, just like our clothing. Like, what do you decide to wear in the morning? There's all sorts of different things you consider. And it changes all the time. Here's my host family. Inside, you're not going to be wearing a bui bui, right? And that's another thing kids don't. I mean, I'm talking to teachers. You guys, you know this stuff, but with students, I found it to be really interesting that they. To talk about what do you wear underneath and when do you take it off, right? If you're in a home of a close female friend and you're going to stay for a while, you would definitely take off your bui bui and wear something different. This is my host family here sitting on their beautiful bed. These are the house servants that they have. They're from up country. So again, I think some of the remnants of the trade links that we just saw in the last presentation about these 2 women are from villages who have been servants in the homes of Swahili in Llamo for a long time. And their brothers came to visit because they had been, servants in this household before. So it's in some ways a strict hierarchy, but also in this house, so a warm relationship. There was very much of a connection of families. So anyway, just different ways that people choose to dress. And again, I did want to mention that there's a piece that kids don't realize about the hierarchy like sometimes in America, you see the idea of wearing the chador or the bui bui as oppression. And of course, there's a status symbol to that. And I think that's what is kind of interesting to students. Here you would see women up country with the conga. Now the conga is another really, really interesting thing to talk about. Elsa, how am I doing on time? Do you have?
We have about 10 minutes left.
Are you still there?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Elsa? I can't hear you.
Can anybody hear me? Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, great.
Elsa,
We
can
have
you hear
about
me?
10 minutes left.
Yes, we hear
I
you.
can't hear you at all.
Kristin, can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
Elsa, can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay, I can't hear you at all. Okay. That's weird. All right, but the rest of you can hear me. Okay, all right. Time? Can you give me the time in the chat? 10, all right, good. I don't know what's going on with our system. I've never had that happen before. All right, so I will just tell you just a few things here. So yeah, but the conga, I do like to talk about this with students because it's actually a way that women can come up in the curriculum, and the role of women can come up in the curriculum. If you see a conga here, you've got the borders. The congas are these like really interesting pieces of cloth, right? Here's one here. They can be worn 1,000 different ways. There are a lot of different traditions about how the conga came to be, but it always has a border. It has some sort of design, and it has a message. And the message is key, right? These women are wearing there so that you can see the message from the outside. If you're in the Swahili area, it's very important that you can see the message of the conga. It also makes it difficult to go shopping for congas with Swahili women because they'll want you to buy the one with the right message, not with the design that you might like. And I think that just speaks to how important the message itself is in the Swahili area. Upcountry, in the Christian areas, it's not as important. They might buy it more for the design, but in the Swahili area, it's really something that people look at. And there are all sorts of different traditions for this. You would, as a woman who had just gave birth, you would expect to get a conga from your husband, and he better have a good message on that conga, right? They are used, there's an unwritten rule that women can say whatever they want on their conga, and some of the things that they say are quite frank. For example, you could have, you know, they often have many, many different types of messages, right? Parents are gold, to take care of them is, or another, a mother's love is better than gold, right? Was one. And that would be a really nice thing if you were happy with your mother and you might wear that. But what if your mother-in-law is in the house and is not treating you well, right? Then you might also go out and buy a mother's love is better than gold to remind her, right? That she should be loving you a little bit better. And so there's just really interesting messages and the different ways that these messages can be used. And in a society that hasn't had, you know, traditionally as much opportunity for women to speak out, this is a really interesting cultural phenomenon. And for those of you who like Paisleys, this congas often have the Paisley, the green mango. They're often, and here it came into the, you know, you saw it woven in Scotland. So in Western Paisleys often have fringy edges, but not necessarily so much in this area. Yeah, so this is the, and men of course have lots of different dress, the kikoi. And I also like to point out with the students that you have, this is the same man, right? This is Othman Lali. He's a really well-known archaeologist in Llamo, in Mombasa area. And this is the same man. And the kids, I put these in because the kids are always so amazed that this is the same guy, right? Which tells you something about like the power and the deception of clothing. And I think like here he's wearing a kanzu and a kofia because we bought them for him as gifts. And here he's knowing he's going to hang out with Americans all day. He's wearing a t-shirt and jeans, right? This is his door. He lives in this gorgeous house, historic house. Just check out the carving on that. It's incredible. So again, education is kind of a phenomenal, like it's obviously extremely influenced by where you are in the world. So here, these kids have just gotten hit by a storm, right? So their school is almost entirely wiped out. Here you can see Christians and Muslims, girls learning right next to each other. Here you can see the influence of American culture with Leave No Child Behind. Girls should be given first priority in education. So this is in a private religious school, but you can see the influence of other cultures. So, and geography, coal right on the coast. So yeah, these are, so now that I've kind of talked a little bit about geography and about the historical processes in Llamo, I'm hoping that it jogs for you a few things that you might think about in your own town, about language, dress, food. Where do these things come from, right? Where does our religion come from? Where does the transportation go? How does this, what do we borrow and what do we blend? And how are we also kind of part of this sort of global processes in the environment that we live in? And as you're kind of thinking about that, I wanted to mention that the reason I even had the idea for this this lesson is from a friend of mine and I were touring. We were touring this horrible Nazi rallying ground and in Berlin, or I mean, sorry, Nuremberg. And here's what the model of this building was supposed to be, right? If Hitler had wanted to build it, and he was going to put a flat roof on that. And when the guide said, you know, here was, you know, Hitler's fantasy of having this was going to last for 1,000 years, but clearly he was going to put a flat roof on it. And then she left it at that. And the whole group of people from New England and Canada laughed heartily, and we started to walk away because what an idiot, right? Who would put a flat roof on this? And a friend of mine from Texas took my hand and said, why is everyone laughing, right? Because of course, why would you know that you must have a tilted roof for that much snow in Texas, right? You don't. So these are just these moments where you realize how much of our lives are dependent on geography and everything like that. So that's it. I will.
Thank you so much, Kristin, during the presentation. Lots of commentary about how useful the concreteness of all of the examples that you used are to bring the Swahili coast, and in particular Llamo, as a vivid experience, and the various aspects of it to our students. There are a couple important comments, I think, that we should bring up. Lots of them around the kanga cloths and what they're made of, what the different adornments. There was one, if you can go back to the slide of the kanga cloth, there was one question around what the kanga cloth to the right of the image. The woman in blue that has a platform, like a platform on it.
This one here, I can't. I don't know.
Does anybody know in the?
Can you read it? I can't see it even.
Anybody know?
But there are, as you said, on the BU website, there are collections of Conga phrases, and I have a list of some of them as well. So they are out there, or you can. There are people who've studied these. And to ask about where they come from, I mean, it's. Sometimes there's a wide variety of sort of ways that the Conga came to be. Some of them connecting to Lowell, Massachusetts, actually, because Lowell produced some of the cloths that were used in the slave trade in East Africa. And then when people got their freedom, they wanted to like mark that they were no longer slaves. So they didn't have any money, so they would begin to decorate it with dots, and some of the earliest dots being from like root stamps, like a potato stamp, you know, the equivalent, where you would get some dye and stamp it. And the word Conga actually comes from it comes from the guinea fowl, which also has dots. So the fabrics, the designs on the fabrics reminded people of guinea fowl. And there's some sense that the borders here come from the Portuguese handkerchiefs that people used to, women would buy them and sew them together. And very smart traders realized that, hey, if you want borders, we can make something bigger and you can use it. And so you see this connection here. And then some other really smart, savvy trader said, wow, I can put a message on this. And then they became like t-shirts, right? So it's a fascinating connection. And some of these are made in India. Using, again, the old families. A lot of these are the same families that have been running these kind of cross-trade networks for ages. But they're designed by through the internet by Swahili women themselves. So the Swahili women tell the traders what they want. And then sometimes they're made in India and sometimes they're made in Tanzania. The best quality ones are made in Tanzania and in Kenya. So there's a lot of fun, crazy connections of this.
Great. Another comment which is useful related to the prior presentation is perhaps we can think of the sophisticated and sanitary housing construction as yet another form of technology from the region. One comment I think which is useful for everyone is to use the enslaved as opposed to slaves as a way of reinvesting active agency into who enslaved whom. There was a discussion, and maybe Susan can jump in here around AH and what it meant.
Oh yeah,
and what date it referred to. So AH is Hijra, which dates from the Prophet Muhammad's migration with his companions from Mecca to Medina, and that's commonly understood as 622, the year 622.
I had another comment, Elsa, about the design that the Paisley design, so-called Paisley design. It has a really interesting history. It's probably very ancient, and I was very interested to hear you possibly refer to it as an unripe mango design, which it may very well be, but I've heard that it is the stamp that a fist would make if you pressed it in ink and pushed it on a fabric, and it comes from South Asia originally. Very, very old design, and then embellished around the edges with whatever it was. And the history of it, of getting to Scotland, was the embroidered shawls that then were imitated, and they were often put on pianos in Victorian times, made in Paisley, Scotland. And the design had got to be called Paisley, total appropriation. And the connection with the conga is that when the conga came into popularity in the 19th century, as I've understood it, there was a very quick connection that you just mentioned about the demand for different types of designs that was very rapidly going back and forth between the West Indian coast, where there were weaving and dyeing printing factories set up, that the European competitors couldn't keep up with the design changes. And so the Indian printing companies with their cotton industry were able to recover the Indian cotton industry that had been put down by the English, with their mechanization.
Yeah.
But they couldn't keep up because the design demands that African women were making could be more quickly fulfilled by the turnaround time in the Indian one. So this is a fascinating, piece of history along with the conga.
Yeah, and you can see here it's called, they hear it green mango, green curry, that they're like, here's a conga that has it even spelled out with the green mango on it. It's just kind of
who knows,
right?
we can't go back that far in time to know what those designs actually were, but
right.
But it's fascinating. And it does look like a green mango, in fact.
Yeah.
And I believe you have a wonderful activity as well that you do with proverbs on kanga cloths, right?
Yeah, so right, I definitely have the kids kind of try to figure out design. Usually I'll show them a couple pictures of it and I'll ask them, like, can you find the pattern? And I only started to do that because I realized they were missing the pattern entirely. And some kids are able to do it really quickly, especially my South Indian students are much more attuned to like the pattern. I just, I think that just because they've been around it, perhaps something similar, or textile. Anybody that's had any exposure to textile culture does a better job, but it's really interesting to see which, like, you'd think it would be simple, but it isn't necessarily for students. And so I found it to be kind of an interesting conversation and a way to talk about women and some of the women's issues by analyzing some of the conga phrases that are popular. I mean, some of them are like, a bee jealously guards her honey. Like some of these things are like, is it stay off my man? It can also be like, keep out of my business. It can be like, this is my actual business. And they can be used in a whole bunches of different ways. And they are, right? If you don't know who the person who the Conga is aimed at will know it, but no one else will, so.
Great, wonderful. Kristin, thank you so much for sharing all of these wonderful ideas. We really appreciate you bringing your practice to us with all of these important points. Thank you for making all these resources available to us, Kristin. It's wonderful. And I think if you could end with one last comment around how your students reconnect to their town and are able to talk about that, and then we'll take a short break and come back for the afternoon sessions.
Yeah, no, I think what came down for us is, well, like we talked about, like what language we speak, right? Why do we, what foods do we eat? Who lives here? Why is it not Native Americans living here? Like there were a lot of, which religions dominate the downtown, like and what industry is not there versus like, and what industry is. And, it's, the questions are really different from town to town. Like, right, the place where I grew up is there in part because of the canals and the railroads, right? So every town has its own sort of story and immigration story. And so I think it's important to remember we're not separate from world history.
There was a comment in the chat box saying that we should all be using cities as case studies for world history, and that's a great entry point for all students. So thank you so much. So